if anyone has proved that sex sells, it's Tom Ford. That's really what he's built his personal identity around. It's really kind of a mantra of everything he's connected to.
In any given era, you have maybe 5 designers who are really moving fashion on all the time. And Tom was definitely one of those 5.
You always see Tom Ford as an individual identity. You always see Tom Ford, in a sense, as a brand. The fact Tom Ford, it was Tom Ford's Gucci. It was Tom Ford's Yves Saint Laurent.
Tom Ford was born in 1961 in Texas, but when he was 7, his parents moved to New Mexico. So, you know, he grew up in that kind of wonderfully colourful world of Santa Fe.
I feel like those two sides of America, kind of the flashiness of Texas and certainly the kind of ethnic influences of Santa Fe have really informed his work.
Like all designers, he adored his mother, his grandmother. The women were a very big influence on him. He was born in a well-off family.
His mother was very sophisticated and his grandmother lived in Santa Fe in New Mexico and dressed in a far more eccentric way. And really it's when Tom Ford was kind of developing his fashion consciousness in his teenage years, it was really the influence of those two women that kind of shaped his aesthetic, and that's really what you can see developing later on in his work.
So he enrolled in NYU to study history of art, dropped out of that quite quickly, moved to California to be an actor/model. I think really his acting was pretty much confined to commercials.
Apparently at one time he was in about 12 national advertising campaigns, but he'll never say which ones now because he doesn't want to be, you know, to see those images coming up on screen.
He said that he didn't, on the one hand, he wanted to break with acting because really he was only a commercial actor. He wasn't, you know, a big movie star. And also on the set of a shampoo commercial, a hairdresser was combing his hair and commented that he was starting to lose it. So that led to him turning back to architecture.
But when he came back to New York, he was getting an even more important sort of education in those New York years. You know, he'd hit New York as a 17-year-old, and he began going to places like the legendary nightclub Studio 54. He hung out at the Factory, he met Andy Warhol there, and also he said in interviews it was then that he realised he was gay. He went to Paris, where Parsons University, oddly enough, actually had a campus. And while in Paris, he was able to do some internship with Chloe.
Working in Paris at Chloe, that was the point when he realised that fashion was what he wanted to do as his career.
He leaves Parsons in Paris, gets himself over to New York, and makes his way to Cathy Hardwicke, which is interesting because she's not a famous designer, really, but she's a successful one, and he wants to learn the commercial side. So he rings Cathy Hardwicke every single day. And one day, sort of in desperation to get rid of him, Cathy Hardwicke herself picks up the phone. And such is the force of Tom Ford's personality that within a couple of minutes she's sort of intrigued, and so she says, how quickly can you come and see me for an interview? And he says, well, about 30 seconds, I'm downstairs in the lobby. She
Asked him what were his 2 favourite European designers, and he said Armani and Chanel. And later on she asked him, you know, why did you say Armani? And he said, because I could see you were wearing something by Giorgio Armani. So no surprises, he got the job.
I think it's very interesting that anecdote sort of sums up, and Tom Ford very proudly tells that anecdote, because it sums up on the one hand his obsession and also his determination, which I think have been real kind of defining factors throughout his career in fashion.
After leaving Cathy Hardwicke, he goes and works for Perry Ellis as a jeans designer again. You know, Tom Ford does not want to starve in a garret. He wants to make clothes that sell, that women wear. When he's in New York designing, you know, Perry Ellis, he meets his lover, Richard Buckley, who was a menswear fashion journalist. And the way Tom always told it to me was that late 80s in New York was quite a sad time because AIDS had just rampaged through the gay community and a lot of people had died. And he and Rich just wanted to go somewhere where it didn't feel so sad. So they moved to Milan and Tom gets a job with Gucci. And in those days, Gucci didn't have much to show for itself. It did handbags, it didn't really do ready-to-wear. Nobody was interested in the handbags, nobody was interested in the Gucci logo.
When Tom Ford went to Gucci in the early 90s, it was really seen as an incredibly passé label. There was lots of infighting amongst the Guccis. The wife of Guccio Gucci had him murdered and was then locked up in prison. So they were very much kind of a tabloidy, scandalous family. And that's what the name Gucci was known for rather than it having kind of a fashion presence. He became creative director in 1994, and really what Tom then started to do was to try and sharpen up the image of Gucci. I think it's quite interesting that he focused on the image, perhaps over and above the clothes. The first collection that kind of really broke ground for Gucci as an entire image was Tom Ford's Spring 1996 collection. That was, again, very, very rooted in the 70s. It was actually rooted, I would say, much more in the Californian idea of the 70s. Amber Valletta wore a pair of velvet Gucci hip huggers with a double G Gucci belt and a satin shirt open to the waist, and Madonna wore exactly the same outfit at the MTV Music Awards. Leading on from that, his Autumn-Winter 1996 show was the one that really caused the sensation. It was inspired overtly by Halston and Halston's collaboration with Elsa Peretti. It featured floor-length white silk jersey gowns with holes cut out over different erogenous zones and pieces of jewellery set into the holes, kind of really emphasising the skin and the body beneath it.
It was this sexy, very confident woman, but she wasn't trussed up. It was very clever and so comfortable, and also it just summed up that era.
The ad campaigns were photographed by Mario Testino with the styling of Kareem Rockfeld and creative direction by Ford himself. I once heard them described as kind of a 70s fantasy of people behaving slightly badly in an underfurnished house. What they represented was this kind of fancy lifestyle, was a lifestyle that the word Gucci could start to represent. And coming off the back of grunge, it suddenly looked incredibly glamorous. It was about people wanting to kind of reclaim the idea of sexuality, which had been incredibly taboo throughout the 80s and the early 90s. And really, I think it's that hardness, that sleekness and that sexiness that came to define Tom Ford's Gucci. It's not about the 70s, but it's about a very particular aesthetic.
So a very short time after he'd taken over at Gucci, their income had actually doubled. So much so that 3 years later they were able to buy the house of Yves Saint Laurent.
The designer Yves Saint Laurent was still alive and had already appointed Alber Elbaz, who's now the designer of Lanvin, to succeed him. As part of the deal, Tom Ford had to be the designer of Saint Laurent. It was the only way that the shareholders would sign off the purchase of the company. So Tom Ford in October 2000 presented his first collection for Saint Laurent. In terms of the fashion industry and in terms of their impact, they were very well received by the press. Yves Saint Laurent himself was extremely unhappy with the designs that Tom Ford created for the house.
Tom Ford is famously called the king of sex, and a lot of that, I think, dates from these late 90s, turn of the millennium years. There was that very famous ad for the Yves Saint Laurent perfume Opium. He got Sophie Dahl naked except for a pair of stilettos and a fabulous necklace, posed, of course, so you couldn't really see anything, but even so, the ad provoked an absolute storm.
From Yves Saint Laurent's point of view, he saw Tom Ford as this American interloper coming in, smashing apart the house that he built, changing the logo, changing the shop interiors, changing everything that Yves loved about his house. At one point, Yves Saint Laurent, the man, actually set up his own boutique selling reissued versions of his designs just up the road from Tom Ford's Yves Saint Laurent boutique in Paris. And I think there was a legal battle to close it down. From Tom's point of view, Yves Saint Laurent was somebody that he'd referenced repeatedly at Gucci. It was a designer that he admired incredibly, and someone that helped to kind of cement that aesthetic that we now so associate with Tom Ford. So for Saint Laurent to hate what Tom Ford was doing under his own name, I suspect was really hard for him. So Tom Ford simultaneously designed Gucci and Yves Saint Laurent men's and women's wear between 2000 and 2004. After his 2004 season, both Tom Ford and the CEO Domenico De Sole left the company.
It was hugely successful what Tom did at Gucci, not just critically, but commercially. I mean, I think by 1999, the business Gucci was valued at $4 billion, and Tom had a big personal financial stake in the business. He was living the Gucci high life by then. Then in 2004, Pinault Printemps Redoute, as they were then called, buy up Gucci, and there's some almighty disagreement, and Tom just walks away. He actually gets very depressed for a while, and of course he does, because he's lost a sort of major part of his life. He's built this brand up from nothing.
In 2005, Tom Ford partnered with Zegna, the Italian menswear manufacturer, to launch a collection in his own name. Zegna are the world's biggest luxury menswear manufacturer, and they are kind of acknowledged as the world's best. He's never presented that collection formally on a catwalk. He presents it in showroom appointments, in static presentations on models, and most recently in a mini show in his London boutique. But the whole idea of that is kind of an intimacy, a real focus on the product. It's really about kind of superlative cut and fit, and it's extraordinarily expensive. I think that a pair of Tom Ford socks will set you back about £100.
His menswear is very opulent, and if you ask him, he thinks it's very English. I don't think it's English at all. I don't know any Englishmen who wear sort of monogrammed slippers and sort of Noel Coward velvet jackets, which is what he was doing. But no matter, international men with a lot of money like that look, and he also, pulls off this great coup of dressing Daniel Craig in Quantum of Solace.
In 2006, Ford posed for the cover of Vanity Fair magazine with Keira Knightley and Scarlett Johansson, both naked.
I think it was kind of a genius move to do that. For me, it's really notable that, Tom Ford reworked the Opium advert for Yves Saint Laurent with Sophie Dahl. It got banned. Tom Ford's just shot the Black Dahlia advert with Cara Delevingne. It's been banned. It's this whole idea of him seeing how far he can push things. Tom Ford always said he didn't want to have his name on anything. He didn't want to have his own label, because he didn't want to, when he was old, to be driving past a house and actually echoing the sentiments of Yves Saint Laurent. He didn't want to drive past something with his name written on it, full of clothes that he would never have designed. So from Tom Ford's point of view, it was quite a brave move, personally, to actually put his name on product, to actually create a Tom Ford label. There was also the fact that Ford was really insistent on keeping it independent, which again, I suppose is connected with the experience of having worked in a large group and having that large group be subject to a corporate takeover. Ford would rather use his own money to back his own label, and actually in order to open 2 boutiques, he sold a self-portrait by Andy Warhol, which I think went for about 30 million, and that enabled him to open 2 boutiques. So it's really very much a labour of love and a personal. It's about Tom Ford personally.
Everyone was waiting for Tom Ford to make his move back into women's wear, but he said that first he was going to go off in another direction and become a film director. In 2005, he started his own production company, Fade to Black, and of course, the first thing that came out of this new stable was A Single Man, co-written by him from Christopher Isherwood's novel, directed by him and financed by him.
I think it's absolutely extraordinary that a designer goes off and does this film, and at the time, of course, everybody was incredibly sceptical. I mean, I think people thought it would bomb. I mean, how could a designer possibly be able to direct, write a film? This was hubris on a sort of terrifying scale because it's so public. The film divided people, but most people absolutely loved that film, and it was incredibly well received critically.
If anything, it was criticised for making everything look a bit too beautiful and a bit too glossy. No surprises there. But nonetheless, it garnered its collection of awards, notably for Colin Firth's performance.
I think the idea of Tom Ford going into directing Hollywood movies is quite obvious. The way that Tom Ford always approached creative direction was with a kind of movie director's eye. He was never just thinking about the clothes, he was never just thinking about the handbag. It was always about a character, it was always about an environment, it was always about a certain story. And it was always very much informed by Hollywood films. You could sense at a Tom Ford show the films that he'd been watching, the references he was looking at. And like a really good film, you knew the kind of era and the feeling that he wanted to evoke with it all. In September 2010, Tom Ford returned to women's wear and presented a collection as part of Spring 2011 New York Fashion Week.
His first show was in a store on Madison. It was very, very small. I mean, I think only sort of maybe 60 fashion editors were there. But in true Tom, so Tom stood there with a microphone introducing the clothes, very old school style, which was lovely. And the models were rather wonderful too, because he had everyone from, I think, Beyonce to Julianne Moore to Lauren Hutton. But, you know, really incredible sort of roster of models who are all his friends that he could call on.
Julianne Moore, I think, has said that until she turned up, she didn't even realise she was supposed to do an actual runway walk. So it really must have had this amazing, intimate, privileged access only feel to it.
And everybody loved that first collection because it sort of looked like clothes that real women could wear, trouser suits. It was very elegant, looked great, madly expensive. Not sure how much of it was even put out there for sale, but no matter, it was his opening calling card, and it was great.
And at a point when designers were scrambling to live stream shows, Alexander McQueen live streamed his Plato's Atlantis show, and designers like Dolce & Gabbana and indeed Gucci were pushing the kind of possibilities of internet live streaming further and further, producing more and more images around their show. The fact that Tom Ford would shut down that, restrict access, he restricted images, he restricted anything going out about the show at all, was a stroke of marketing genius. The whole idea was to upend what everybody else was doing in fashion and doing the exact opposite. And really that was, for Tom Ford, it was the way to launch women's wear in a really crowded, even oversaturated women's wear market, and to really make his mark, really place his stamp on women's wear.
Of course, a lot of famous and showbiz personalities have worn Tom Ford clothes. I mean, besides the usual Hollywood and the very sexy, the very wonderful dresses that you might expect, one that particularly interests me is the dress that he made for Michelle Obama to wear to Buckingham Palace, to a state dinner, because, of course, you can't do King of Sex for that one. And he did this rather fat, wonderful classical dress in sort of ivory cream with these straps over the shoulder.
I think the thing with Tom Ford's clothes is they are incredibly expensive and incredibly specific. It's this whole idea of appealing to a very specific type of woman. I remember going to a Tom Ford show and he'd done a sequined evening dress version of the counterfeit Tom Ford football jersey that Jay-Z wears when he performs his song Tom Ford. Tom Ford. But really, I think that for me, that garment, which was shown with velvet high-heeled cowboy boots, it really kind of summarises Tom Ford, because you either loved it or you absolutely loathed it. And the women who are buying these kind of clothes will either absolutely hate it and will never go inside, or would buy it in every colour available.
I'll be the late night lady you won't recognise. I'm a chameleon, I'm all
think with menswear it's a wider appeal. It's based in suiting, it's based in classics, it's based in making something incredibly well, whereas the women's has a certain fashion impact. It's interesting to think about him in the context of labels like Chanel and Dior, because Tom Ford has said that he wants to be like Chanel and like Dior. He wants Tom Ford to go on and be that kind of thing. And I think he's achieving it. I think that this whole idea of creating an instantly identifiable identity for Tom Ford, which can span across menswear, womenswear, accessories, eyewear, makeup, cosmetics. He's done it all. He's done it in a decade. He's established what it took Dior 50 years to do, and he's done it in 10 years. When you look at that, kind of the accolades that Tom's had really makes sense. He won the CFDA Lifetime Achievement Award in 2014, but then the year after winning the Lifetime Achievement Award, he won the Menswear Designer of the Year. So it's really this whole idea that he can be awarded for a lifetime and then be awarded again on top of that by the same body. I think that's really telling.
Oh, Tom Ford's unstoppable, I think. I love that Tom is this presence. I think he's so intelligent and so funny and he's a really positive thing. He makes celebrities look fantastic on the red carpet, and you know what he did with his last show was very clever, because he normally shows in London, but he took it to LA in last February, and all the celebrities loved it. And you know, it was just before the Oscars, and how savvy of him.
The reason that I love Tom Ford, the reason I think Tom Ford is such a strong designer, the reason I think Tom Ford has such prominence on the international scene is I think it's incredibly honest. This is genuinely the way that Tom feels people should look at this point in time. I think he's often denigrated as a marketing man and as a pure image maker, but what people kind of forget to realise is that there's real truth behind those images. That's why it all works, that's why it has worked, and that's why it continues to work today.
I'll be the late night lady you won't recognize. I'm a chameleon, I'm always in disguise. I read your future, but it's written in the past.